going to be featuring Nobody's Pilgrims on Books with Bridgetti. It's a novel about three teenagers escaping the United States-Mexico border and pursued by evil. The book is written by multi-award winning author Sergio Troncoso. Don't go, we'll be right back. If you've just joined us, then a hearty warm welcome to Books with Bridgetti, where storytellers feel right at home. I'm your host, Bridgetti Limbanda from Cape Town in South Africa, and our stream is made possible by StreamYard and BeLive Media. If this is your first time watching us, then welcome, and we'd love to give you a shout out if you let us know that you are watching for the first time. In today's show, we're going to be talking to Sergio Troncoso about his book, Nobody's Pilgrims, a novel about three teenagers escaping the United States-Mexico border and pursued by evil. But now, before I bring on our amazing guest, I want to say welcome to Marcello. He is watching us over on LinkedIn. So whether you're watching us over on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter, also on Amazon Live or YouTube, a hearty warm welcome. It's great to have you here. Now, a lot of the authors are still having to work remotely, or they are using a hybrid option of sharing their books. And just in general, I think a lot of authors have pivoted using online media to share their stories. So I thought I'd just give you one or two tips to help you level up on being able to present your books in a great way to audience. One of the things that I recommend is that you can use an external camera. It'll give people a much clearer view of your work, your books in this case. And what I recommend is any one of the Logitech range of external cameras, because it's very, very sharp. And I use Logitech Brio, for example, because it's got right light technology, which is trademarked, which means the lighting adapts automatically. I love automatic. Who doesn't love automatic? The other thing I recommend is that you use a tripod, because some people go live with their phone, and there's nothing wrong with that. You can use your phone. What I do recommend is that you use something to stabilize your phone. And one of the things that you can do, for example, to help you, so that you can angle it very easily, is something like the iographer. There's all kinds of things, but this is just one of the things that you can use. You can also use one of these DJI Osmo stabilizers. Any you can find, but stabilize your phone, because if you don't, people will get seasick and they'll get distracted. So that's not what you want to do. The other thing you also want to do is pay attention to your audio, so that people can hear you nice and clearly. People will tune out from your broadcast if your sound isn't clear. So I recommend you investing in something like the Rode lavalier microphone. It's just a clip-on thing. It's easy. You can hide it under your clothes if you wish, but it's plug and play, very, very easy. Or if you want to get something a little bit more fancy, you could use something like what I'm using, which is a Samsung condenser microphone. It's got a die-cast solid construction, so it reduces vibrations. But you really don't have to be that fancy. If you can just invest in one of these clip-on microphones. Now let's move on to our author, because I really want to talk to him, and I'm sure you want to hear more about his amazing book as well. So before I bring him onto the screen with me, let me just introduce him briefly. Sergio graduated magna cum laude from Harvard and has 2 graduate degrees from Yale. He's a Fulbright scholar, president of the Texas Institute of Letters, and he teaches at the Yale Writers Workshop. He's the author of the book, obviously, we're going to be talking about, which is Nobody's Pilgrims, a novel about 3 teenagers escaping the United States-Mexico border, pursued by evil. He also wrote a book which we spoke about previously on the show, A Peculiar Kind of Immigrant Son, and he also edited Nepantla Familias, which is an anthology of Mexican and American literature on families in between worlds. I do encourage you to go and check out all these books. So if you're having a look in the carousel, if you're watching the show over on Amazon Live, you will notice that I've put all these books in the carousel. So please, please, please go and check them out. So with I'm not going to waste any more time. Let's get Sergio onto the show to come and join us. Sergio, welcome. It's so great to have you back on the show again. I'm absolutely in awe of your amazing accomplishments that you've done, and I'm particularly in awe because it's not that you had parents who were highly educated or were authors that got you into this. So can you just briefly tell everyone a little bit about yourself, how you managed to get a really, really good education despite the odds?
Well, thank you, Bridgetti, for inviting me to your show again. I love being on your show. And I grew up on the U.S.-Mexico border in Texas, but the Mexico was probably a stone's throw away, less than a quarter of a mile from my house, which my parents themselves built. It was out of adobe. And they had crossed over in the 1950s and became first legal residents and then citizens. But it was a shanty town. We had no electricity for the first year. We had kerosene lamps and stoves. And then we had, an outhouse in the backyard where we didn't have indoor plumbing. So it was definitely not a ritzy beginning. But I think my parents, who were very typically very Mexican in their work ethic, they taught us to work very hard, to work until we dropped every day, and then do it again the next day, and do it again after that, and Saturdays and Sundays, and in the summer. And I was a bookworm in Isleta, just like one of my characters in the novel Duty. I was this chubby kid who loved to read in a poor neighborhood. And I think that's really what propelled me, basically, to become a very good student in grade school and high school. I was writing for the high school newspaper in Isleta High School. And I would say over half the kids in that high school probably did not go to college. So it was not your typical rich prep school. It was actually the opposite. And I was accepted to Harvard and many other Ivy League schools and Stanford. And I decided to go to Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And of course, I didn't know what I was getting myself into. I didn't know what the Ivy League was. I didn't know the academic pressure I would face, which was tremendous. And from there, from Harvard, and I buckled down. I studied until the libraries closed. I did not want to fail because of my parents' sacrifice to get me there. And I also had this very tough grandmother whom I've written about in many of my stories, my early stories. And she was this tough as nails older lady who, according to family lore, she shot and killed two men who attempted to rape her during the Mexican Revolution as she was a teenager then. And so she had this grit about her, this toughness that I loved. So from Harvard, using my grandmother's example of don't give up, I went to Yale and I got 2 graduate degrees at Yale. And I now teach at the Yale Writers Workshop. And this is Nobody's Pilgrims is my 8th book. So that is a short capsule of my life.
Where did your love for writing start? Like, how did you come to love writing so much?
Well, it starts with 2 people, I think. It starts first on the more intellectual side. When I was a high school writer in El Paso and writing for the school newspaper, I talked to my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, Santiago Troncoso, who's a very well-known Mexican journalist. And he was founder and editor of the first daily newspaper in Juarez, Mexico, which is right across the river from El Paso. And so he led a very colorful life, writing critical articles about Mexican government corruption, and he was thrown in jail 28 times, and his print shop was firebombed 3 times. And of course, when I told him I was interested in writing, he said, "Don't become a writer, because if you tell the truth, people will hate you forever." And then the other probably very important influence on writing very early on was my grandmother. This my maternal grandmother, my mother's mother. She was a great oral storyteller. She would tell me these violent, exciting stories of the Mexican Revolution, and she had no social filters. So for a kid, she would tell me violent and awful stuff that, of course, I probably shouldn't be hearing about as a kid, but that's what I wanted to hear, right? Exactly what was prohibited to me. And my grandmother didn't care, and my parents wouldn't stop her. And so she would spend hours in her tenement in downtown El Paso telling these stories, and 12, 15 people would gather around her, and I was there with her. She would be smoking her cigarette and drinking her coffee and telling these stories that would go on for 3, 4, 5 hours, past midnight to 1 in the morning, Saturdays and Sundays. And I just loved the storytelling ability she had, and how she could naturally tell a story. And so I think these 2 early influences were what got me into storytelling and writing.
That is just absolutely amazing, and somehow I often, when I hear similar stories, it's, you almost wish you could go back and have the ability to write down all those great stories that they had shared. Writing back then is not as available as it is now,
Right.
It's easier to write a book now than it was back then.
One of the smart things I did as I started writing and before my grandmother died, is I recorded her on these, the old cassette tapes. So I have cassette tapes of her, telling some version of the story she told me as a kid. And so I have her voice. And this was before the iPhone, before smartphones. So I did start thinking, my grandmother's not going to be here forever. I really need to capture her voice and her stories. And so I have like 2 of these cassette tapes of her telling me about her life.
That is bliss. That is absolutely, absolutely precious. Oh my goodness, my goodness. Now, you've got a library named after you, for example. I don't know, when, very few people probably ever in their life. How did that come about?
Well, I grew up in Isleta, which was a neighborhood on the east side of El Paso, Texas. And so when I left and became a writer and started teaching, and my book started coming out, I often wrote about the border. I often wrote about Isleta and El Paso, Texas. And in 2014, I got this call in the middle of, I think it was a Friday, and they said, it was a city council, a staffer from the city council who said, you have to get to El Paso in 3 days on Monday, because it's something very important and something very good that's going to happen. And they didn't tell me what it was. So I thought, maybe it's some sort of proclamation or something. I didn't know exactly what it was. And so I showed up, I dropped everything, and it was a very expensive plane ticket, because as you know, when you have to get somewhere in 3 days, it's very different. And the city council, after hearing about my life story and all of the work that I've done for literacy and reading for kids from El Paso, Texas and the border, they decided to rename the branch library in Isleta as the Sergio Troncoso Branch Library. And it was a unanimous vote. And I was very proud. I was very flabbergasted, frankly, for the honor. It's probably one of the greatest honors I've received as a writer. And I think one of the things they certainly wanted to do is to encourage kids to read. That this poor kid from that neighborhood who lived within walking distance of the current new library named after me, he made it very far. And the one of the ways he made it very far was because he loved to read. He loved to write. He loved to tell stories. And I think it was also their way of encouraging that process, that reading, that focus. And really, it's a good point, because there are a lot of intelligent kids that don't have a lot of money. In fact, not even working class, but below working class. And they're intelligent, they're good at math, they're good at reading, they're good at a lot of different skills, and they're just not given the chance, and they're not given the focus. And I think that's something we all should always be striving for, to identify these kids who have the right work ethic and who are talented and intelligent and want to make themselves better and help their families. And that's still true today. And one of the reasons, by the way, after they named the library after me, I established the Troncoso Reading Prizes in the library, which we give out every year for the kids who read the most books from September to November. And I give out 6 prizes, which I fund myself. I fly in. I award the librarians decide which kid read the most books, because they report every week what they're reading, and I give them free books, and I have conversations with the parents, so it ends up becoming like a 2 or 3 hour education literary fest, and I love that. I basically am paying kids to read.
Wow, that is absolutely awesome. I really love that you've embraced the children that come to the library in that way, and you formed a relationship. So we spoke before the show that you also interact with these children on computer. Tell us a little bit about how that works, and
Sure.
How that children.
So I do a lot of programming. I'm right now speaking to you from New York City, which is where I live. And so to retain that connection to Texas and the border and many other places, because not only Texas, I do a lot of phone calls and Zoom calls in California as well. I have talks with students in the libraries. The librarians set it up, and every month, we get together and we talk about reading, or we talk about writing, or we just have an informal conversation. And I think that also makes them feel like the name on the library is also not some abstraction, but some person they can talk to. And
it's a real person.
It's a real person right there. And in fact, for kids, by the way, they love the video. They love the connection through the internet. That's kind of what they're used to. So I love having these conversations, and I have had them with schools in Massachusetts, in California, but primarily, of course, in Texas, which is where I'm from. And I just feel like I know these kids. Those kids were me when I was younger. and I want to encourage that love of reading and storytelling, and focusing on school, and I think when they get to know me, often at a certain point, I really create a relationship with them and help them with their writing. They even tell me about their essays that they're working on, and they share a little bit, a minute or two. And so I give them tips on how to improve their essays. And so all of this, I think, is my way of connecting and keeping a connection to the border, which I love, and I know very well.
That is just amazing and heartwarming at the same time. Because, one of the reasons I've loved live streaming is also because of the connections that you can make. If it
Right.
wasn't for live, I would not meet you.
Well, it's a way to use technology to connect. Like when I can't be there, I can be there through the computer. I can talk to people, and I'm happy to do that. I'd love to do that, and I think a lot of writers do events, but I think a lot of writers should do more community-based events in which they're not necessarily selling books. They're just trying to communicate the love of reading to a local community and help them and be there to answer their questions. Not to impose something on them, but to answer their questions.
That's the big thing, and that's something that I advocate for as well, is a lot of people think computer, they think in webinar where they just, it's a one-way television style push out information. But what you're talking about, I also am very passionate about, is using the internet the way we're doing now, where it's interactive. In other words, viewers can interact with you. So you're actually creating relationships with people for real. It's not like a television show where you're watching passively. You have no way of communicating with the person there. Although that's
Yeah,
changing somewhat. A lot of the studios are now, you have presenters sitting there with an iPad
right.
but you can't, with nature, you don't really have conversations like this.
Right.
It's I'm
One thing
talking
is,
to you in real time.
yeah, and one thing is you have to like people. Not all writers like people. I like people. I like interacting with them. I like listening to them and answering their questions. And and it's part of why I like teaching. I love teaching a writing workshop. I teach at Yale. And when I'm there, those 11, 12 students in my workshop, I give them everything. I listen to them, but I also teach them what I know, and I also answer the questions. And it's very much of a teaching and learning as much as from the teacher's point of view. I learn as much from my students as I teach them as well, and I think it's a different mentality than just sort of lecturing and giving people information, but it's assuming that your audience is intelligent.
Absolutely. So your books seem to all carry a very similar theme. Tell us a little bit about that. The stories. I mean, the stories are all different, but the all seems to have a common theme. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I mean, that's a good question. Do they have a common theme or not? I would say almost all my books in some way relate to the border or immigrants, or to whether it's a story about set in El Paso, or like this one about immigrants going deep into the United States and looking for their American dream, which is what Nobody's Pilgrims is really about. These three teenagers searching for their American dream and escaping the border. So it's unlike my other books in which they were actually set on the border. And then I have a novel, of course, that's set at Yale, where I teach, which is about an immigrant that arrives at Yale and tries to, uncover a mystery that he finds there. So I think all my books, I would say, are about, creating a new America. How are these immigrants either create or fail or succeed in trying to make the United States a home, but it's also heavily influenced by philosophy. People don't know that, I have a graduate degree in philosophy, so many of the questions I have are philosophical. How do you create a community? How does the community fall apart? How do you create a bond of friendship between, let's say, these three that is an outsider community against a broader community that is in many ways against them? And so all of these questions, often when I begin a novel or begin an essay, are philosophical questions that have been dealt with by Aristotle and Plato and other people, Nietzsche, Heidegger, Wittgenstein. What about language, the role of language in creating community or in undermining it? And so all of these...
That's a very interesting point. That's a very, very interesting point of how language influences a community, building community, does it divide a community? And very interesting one.
Yeah. No, and as from reading part of the novel, Duty and Molly, who are from very different places. Duty being the 17-year-old protagonist. All three of them are protagonists in the novel. But she's from a working class white girl from Steelville, Missouri, with 2,000 people. And she's never been to the border. And Duty is in this stolen pickup that stops, in her town. And one of the ways they connect is through language. She's interested in Spanish. He starts teaching her Spanish. They start being very playful with words. They both love to read. And this is what connects them. And in fact, what prompts their slow burning love affair, that gets hotter as the novel progresses.
So is the story purely fictional, or are there some real stories interwoven in there?
Well, this one, Nobody's Pilgrims, is purely fictional. It's, Duty is, there are three protagonists. I'll tell you a little bit about the novel. Duty is a 17-year-old Mexican-American from El Paso. And Arnulfo is also 17. He's an undocumented immigrant who's working in a chicken farm in El Paso. And Duty and Arnulfo meet at this chicken farm. They're just working there. Arnulfo wants to send money back home. And he tells Duty, I'm leaving the next day in a pickup. I'm getting a ride from Juanito, this old man who's a foreman in the chicken farm. And Duty goes, they split. Duty goes back home. This is the very beginning of the novel. So I'm not telling the readers really what's going to happen. Duty has a difficult family life. He's an orphan, and he's staying with his aunt. And his aunt's family really does not want him there. So something terrible happens that night. And Duty decides on a lark, I'm going to meet with Arnulfo, where he's meeting this truck to get a ride to Kansas City, and I'm going to hitch a ride with him. And that really begins the novel. So they begin this ride in a blue pickup truck with Juanito, the foreman, driving. And in Lubbock, they see that Juanito gives a bribe to the immigration officer at a checkpoint. And so they know they're carrying some sort of contraband, and they're being used as drug mules unwittingly, or they think it's drugs, but it's actually something much worse than drugs. And so they decide to ditch Juanito at a rest stop, and they steal the blue pickup. And this is really what begins the novel. Bad people start coming after them. There's a narco who is blonde and blue-eyed from Texas. He's coming after them because he wants this very valuable cargo and dangerous cargo that's in the pickup. There's some narcos from Mexico that are also pursuing them to get what's in the pickup. And of course, Duty and Arnulfo decide to hide, and they're going across country. And the reason they want to go to Connecticut is because Duty read some books when he was in El Paso about this sort of idyllic version of New England. and beautifully green, and he wants to see it, and that's sort of his view. And of course, as they traverse the country, sort of it goes from idealism to realism. You know, eventually what they reach is the real Connecticut, where some people want them there and other people don't want them there. And they have to go through a lot of trials. But on the way, of course, they stop at the Mark Twain National Forest, because Duty has Mark Twain in a basket of books that he has in the back of the pickup, and that's where they meet Molly. They meet Molly Crump, who helps them out in a difficult situation, and she decides to get a ride with them too, not knowing that they're being pursued by evil people. So this is still, I have not really revealed, the major issues in the novel, but it's about these three teenagers who become fast friends, and they're all outsiders. Molly's also an orphan, so two of them are orphans, and Arnulfo is an undocumented immigrant. They really don't belong anywhere other than with themselves, and it's forging this community in a sort of a life raft situation, but instead of a life raft, it's a stolen blue pickup, in which one of them is giving up and they're in trouble, and let's say Arnulfo pulls them out. At another moment, the boys are in trouble, and Molly is the one who saves them. And these trials and luck and intelligence that they use to get out of their situation, this is what forges their bond. An unbreakable bond in which they're very different, yet they belong together. And at a certain point, they give up their lives for each other, because of how they created this community. So it really is about forming a new America among the young that's very different from the America around them. And of course, the last thing I'll say is the novel was written, turned in, and delivered final draft, basically what you read in the book, on February 29th, 2020, which was the last leap day that we had. We have them every 4 years. And this was before there was 10 or 15 cases of COVID in the United States. This is before COVID even had the name COVID. And of course, what's happening in the dystopia America that the three teenagers are driving through, it's collapsing because of a pandemic. And so in many ways, the novel predicted the pandemic that was to follow. And it's a different kind of pandemic. It's a Marburg B, which is transmitted by touch instead of by air. And it has a much higher kill rate. It's 80% of people who get it die. So, of course, if this had happened in the United States, hundreds of millions would have died rather than 1 million or so. And I just thought in 2018 and 2019, what would set this country at each other's throats? And I thought it was a pandemic would. And unfortunately, the prediction came right. And for me, it was about another trial that these teenagers have to go through to survive and stay together, this pandemic trial. And so that's sort of the interesting part about the novel. And the reason it took so long to come out was Cinco Puntos, the original publisher, was bought by Lee and Low Press from New York City. And Lee and Low are the ones who put out the novel eventually. And so the transaction plus the moving of resources from basically Texas to New York City, that all took time. And also there was a debate, like, do readers want to read about a pandemic in the middle of a pandemic?
Yes,
Right.
I'm sure that was a consideration.
Right. So now that we're sort of mostly out of it, and we're not quite out of it, but I guess mostly out of it, I think this novel is about grit and survival, and the American dream living very strongly in these young people that refuse to give up, even when maybe they should give up, even when maybe they should not try to fight for what they want, and yet they always do. And I think that's one thing I've always admired in my sons. I have two young sons, that they see a lot of problems, but they don't give up. They don't give up on what they believe their American dream is, and they keep fighting for it. And in many ways, this story is about them and that kind of youthful energy and really bonding. You know how young people bond with somebody they
They
just meet,
do.
and
They do.
as we get older, we stop having that sort of serendipitous connections. You know, we start being very cautious, and their lack of caution is in part, you know, with Turi, Molly, and Arnulfo, it's what brings them together. They
I know
decide,
it always amazes me how quickly young people make friends. It
right,
doesn't take them, it takes them 5 minutes and they create a bond that lasts a lifetime. It's
exactly,
crazy how that works.
yeah.
But even though this is a novel and even your other books, did you intend for them to be educational on some level?
Well, I mean, I would say educational is probably too strong a word. I would say it. I always love a good story, and this one on my Word file before it had a title, I always called it my adventure novel. So I always want to please the reader and to make the reader get excited about a story and what's going to happen to the characters. So for me, that's always preeminent in my mind. Um, but I think in the sense of, yes, we have connections. Some rural white person from Missouri, yes, does have a connection with a Mexican American from El Paso and even an undocumented immigrant. Yes, we actually have more in common with each other than we have things that pull us apart.
Yeah.
And yes, we should fight for the country you want, and not just give up on, you know, these adults that are coming after you that are trying to tear us apart. So in that sense, I guess it's broadly educational, but I'm really thinking of a great story to tell with these characters that lived in my mind for many years.
I still think it's great because, the stories to me are so relatable. I think when people read it, you know, and you have a great way of gripping readers' attention. So just for anybody out there who's maybe a new author, what does it take to write a page turning novel? Because not everyone has got that skill. Because I think everyone aspires to get to that point where you can't put the book down. You want to just keep reading all night because you want to finish the book. So what does it take to acquire that level of skill?
Well, I would say years of hard work. I mean, I when I wrote this novel, it was, you know, I had already written seven before, and so I approached this novel very differently. I said my first draft, I wanted to move as fast as possible, so I would just I wrote my first draft without going back and rewriting those early chapters. I just kept it going. So I ended up with this behemoth of 400 or 500 pages of their story. And before I even wrote those 400 or 500 pages, I knew these characters really well. I'm a literary fiction writer, so for me, it all starts with character. I knew their family backgrounds. I knew what they looked like. I knew how they moved. And I knew the secrets they wouldn't tell themselves. I knew the secrets of their families. And so for me, it's about interviewing and really understanding the characters really well before I even wrote that first draft. And once I start dreaming about Molly or dreaming about Turi or dreaming about Arnulfo, I know they're real to me as people. And so the story sort of, they took me to where they wanted to go. And so that was the first draft, which I did not edit, did not stop. I just wanted to write it as fast as possible as the story was unfolding in my mind. And then, of course, to get the tightness, the suspense, it was all about pruning back. It was all about cutting, cutting, cutting. You know, there are entire chapters that ended up on the cutting room floor on Turi's accident that, you know, that killed his parents. And the same thing with Molly's parents and how they died in a fire. the chapters and so I knew exactly what happened and how it happened, and even how Molly's parents were, but none of that ended up in the novel. And so when you're trying to create suspense, you have to start pairing chapter by chapter, seeing where the reader is ending on this chapter and what will propel the reader to the next chapter. And if something is there that's excess, you got to cut it away. You got to trim it. So it was trimming those 400 or 500 pages into the book that you have in front of your hand, and shaping the narrative. What is missing to create more tension? Can I make a narco like El Hijo de Huerta, one of the people keep writing about, this really badass narco who will not stop. He will not stop until he gets his prize, until he gets them. That's what he's been charged for, almost like a Terminator narco, going after them. And so I added layers of suspense by adding characters and adding situations that would keep the reader guessing, and even putting in false hints, making the reader go this way when I'm really going to go right, or this other way.
Yeah.
And so all of that you sort of do in the rewrites, of course. And so that's how I came up with my story. But it was years of hard work, which started really in 2018. And on Marburg B, there was a real Marburg virus, and so I did a lot of research in Germany about this virus that was transmitted by touch, and it was like Ebola but worse in some ways. And I imagined, well, what would happen to the United States and our communities, and do we believe in each other? Do we work together if something like this is unleashed, on this country or any country?
Mm-hmm.
And so all of that took a lot of years of work.
I can well imagine the amount of research that must have gone into there, and it's still uncanny the way things ended up unfolding. That was just amazing. Can I ask you to read a section out of the
Sure.
book for us?
So I'll give you a choice, and this is very short, either at the very beginning or toward the end, because I have these two pieces I've read. Maybe I'll read a paragraph just from the end. It's not the end; it's like 2/3 in the novel. But at the very beginning, at the very beginning, Turi has this very idealistic view of Connecticut, very pastoral and beautiful, because he's getting it through books. And so this other,
before you read,
uh-huh.
won't you just hold up your copy of the book? I want to ask you to just talk a little bit about the cover of the book.
Yeah.
Tell me how you came up with that design.
So the cover is by a great graphic designer from Texas. His name is Antonio Castro, and he's head of the graphic design department at the University of Texas, El Paso. And he's actually done the covers for my last 3 books, A Peculiar Kind of Immigrant Son, Nepantla Familias, and Nobody's Pilgrims. And so he's the one, he read the manuscript, and, we talked about what Turi, Molly, and Arnulfo would look like. And so this is sort of his take on them. And also sort of the purple is about, probably a dystopian landscape that they're going through. And by the way, this little symbol in the middle of Turi's shirt is a microscopic view of the Marburg virus that I sent to Antonio so he could replicate it on the T-shirt.
That is amazing. That is absolutely amazing.
Yeah, but Antonio is
he captured the characters so well.
Yeah, no, he did, and a lot of it is because I think Antonio. One of the reasons I love his designs, and he's won awards in Mexico City and Germany for his poster designs. He's an incredible graphic designer, but he actually reads the novel. He knows the characters. I didn't just tell him who Turi, Molly, and Arnulfo were. He read the novel, and he said, "This is what I imagine that they are." And so you have to really know the designer very well, and the designer has to do some work to be able to capture them so beautifully.
That's why I think your covers are unique and why they stand out so much. Now I understand. I don't. I mean, I've interviewed so many authors over the last 4 years, and I'm not aware of anyone else who's done that, because one of the questions I always ask authors is, how did you come up with the cover? And some of them just, it's like a random, choose the cover that you like.
Well, I mean, I always think, and of course, sometimes publishers listen to you, and sometimes publishers ignore you, on the cover image. But I think, I see my work as a literary artwork, as a work of art. And so if I, once I discovered Antonio, who actually will read the books and will try to match visually what's the content of the book with an image, then I discovered the exact right kind of book designer that I love. Because you're right, usually it's random, or it's just to attract the eye, but it has nothing to do with what's inside the content of the book. And he sees it the same way I do, which is if I'm going to design a book cover, it has to be true to the content inside the book.
I love that. I have yet come across anyone else who's had that take on a designer reading the book so that they design the cover with the contents in mind. Because usually an author will say to me, I am trying to transmit thoughts of how I envision it to be. And then, the artist has kind of to translate that. But I think the approach of knowing the story and then designing the cover to match the story is amazing. And that's why I think almost all your covers are just so striking, because it immediately tells you what's going to be inside the book.
Right. No, and it's about caring about what, not just the words inside the book, but the face of the book. And as I tell Antonio, I want you to do the face of my book. And it's because he's he's a special graphic designer that really cares about his work. And I'm sure there are others like him, but they're probably not normal. Most graphic designers probably just do whatever the publisher tells them to do. But Antonio will read the book, and Antonio will try to write something that captures, some of the most important themes in the book.
Amazing. Are you going to read us a section?
Yeah, so I'm just going to read a paragraph, and this is usually I read two parts when I read from Nobody's Pilgrim. The first part is the very first paragraph or so, which is a very idealistic view of Connecticut before Tootie has ever been there. He's just discovered a book on it in the El Paso library. And this section I'm going to read is the other one. When they get to the real Connecticut toward the last 2/3 of the book, it's something terrible has happened. I won't tell you what it is. And they're in Connecticut now, the real Connecticut. They're trying to survive. And some writers have said, Sergio, this is your best paragraph. And so I'm going to read it. And it's on page 219. And it's basically the realistic Connecticut that they have. It's near midnight. They drive west on Route 202 through Avon, Canton, and Torrington, Connecticut. The dark, empty streets in front of them are a reflection of what's inside Tootie's head. The street lights mindlessly blinking yellow at corners. No lights inside any stores. No one out anywhere. Nothing. The nothingness called to Tootie. He'd like to open the truck's door and succumb to the river of glittery black asphalt coursing underneath them. Molly's hand keeps him from doing it. Molly's warmth on his hand, Molly's head on his shoulders, the scent of Molly's breath wafting around his neck, she mercifully asleep. Even Rudy's grim face as Tootie glances at him, his fierce eyes that never stray from the road, and his 2 tears, half dry, on the cheek of brown granite. All of these images keep duty from yanking open the truck's door and jumping into the night. So anyway, that's the last paragraph on page 219. And Rudy is a person that comes to the rescue at that moment. Somebody else they meet in Connecticut, somebody who actually helps them. And so it sort of portrays the other side once they get there, the trials, these pilgrims are going through. And I really do see them as modern day pilgrims. These are the young people trying to make their way to a hostile territory, and they have to face difficult trials to create a community with each other.
That is just amazing. So anybody who's watching on Amazon Live, please go and grab a copy of Nobody's Pilgrims. This is an amazing, amazing, amazing story. It's a lot of work has gone into it. Cover is absolutely beautiful, as is the story. So do grab a copy. And if you're watching on any of the other channels, please go over to Amazon and get a copy of this book. Sergio, what's up? What's next for you? Have you got anything else in the works?
Oh, well, I'm working on a possible historical novel set in Texas, but at the moment I'm just in the middle of research. So I'm working on that. I'm also working, I think, on a book of essays. I have a lot of essays that I've published, and I have a few that are unpublished that I probably will try to shape into a book of essays. And I'm always busy. At the moment, I'm traveling a lot through for Nobody's Pilgrims. And I just finished being president of the Texas Institute of Letters at the end of April. So I'm just getting my sleep after that.
A little bit.
Right. And just exhaling, and relaxing after being responsible for this large organization and their banquets. And we had a big banquet in El Paso. They were very successful. Everything went very well. But it's, as the president, you're responsible for everything from ordering the food to, doing the hotel contracts to getting all 200 writers or so there, and making sure they all have a great time. And then
that's a lot of work.
Oh yeah, and the programming days before the banquet, getting readers there and getting them into the libraries in the city. And so, oh my gosh, it's more than a full-time job. And I did it for 2 years. I'm grateful. I love the Texas Institute of Letters. It's a 2-year term as president. And so I'm done. It was a very successful term, and now it's somebody else's turn.
Nice. That sounds great. Sergio, thank you so much for your time and for sharing Nobody's Pilgrims with us. And we look forward to your next book. Are you, where can people, if people want to reach out to you, how can they connect with you?
So, Bridgetti, before we leave, I wanted to thank you for inviting me back to your program. It's always a delight to talk with you. The easiest way to get a hold of me is through my website. It's, my name, my website. It's sergiotroncoso.com. And I'm on right there on the front page is Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn connections. Also, I'm on Linktree. So if you type in my name, you'll find me there. And my email is right on the front page of my website. So I'm very easy to get a hold of.
Awesome. Sergio, this was amazing. I want to say, huge big thanks to our audience on Amazon Live, on Facebook, on Twitter, and YouTube. It was amazing to have you join us. Thank you so much. And go and grab a copy of Nobody's Pilgrims. Take care, everyone. We'll see you on the next episode of Books with Bridgetti.